All right, we are on and we are live. Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of Charge Forward with Chargebacks 911, where we talk all things payments, fraud, and whatever else keeps merchants up at night. Today's episode is a very special one. It's on Visa's brand new VAMP program. We're going to be talking about some major changes that kicked in this year, changes that honestly could catch a lot of businesses off guard if they're not paying close attention. But not to worry, I'm not going to be doing this solo. I've got Zak Matthews with me. He's a fraud expert, dispute veteran, and a proud resident of Las Vegas, Nevada. Zak works with some of our top tier clients at Chargebacks 911. And if you've ever been to a payments trade show or tuned into a podcast on fraud, there's a good chance you probably heard him speak. So Zak, thanks so much for being here. How's life out in the desert?
It's fantastic. Actually, was just out at a trade show the last couple days.
What show was that?
Bitcoin 2025. I don't think I need to explain, but everything cryptocurrency. So everything from credit cards that allow you to access like a literal swipeable Visa, or excuse me, it's a MasterCard, but right, like an actual physical credit card that you can swipe and the company does an exchange against your Bitcoin. So right, like those types of innovation. So I've been down there the last couple of days. Stepped away actually this morning to do this webinar and podcast.
Well, thank you so much for making time in your schedule. Now, there's a pretty big change with cryptocurrency, and as far as banks being able to adopt those, I feel like I just read something a few weeks ago about that. So was that the talk of the show?
There's actually a bunch of regulation, and I think what you're referring to is the reserve bill. So currently, crypto is not regulated from the perspective of having to require hold a reserve, like a treasury, similar to how like you normally have to do when you have financial instruments on your balance sheet. And so it's interesting, right? Like it's not backed by anything is arguably what that comes down to. So the regulation is really getting into that. And I think historically the conversation was about whether or not it needed to or not from like a macro perspective. And I think the new regulation is more focused on like stopping certain types of institutions from being involved if they don't conform to the more traditional ways of regulating that type of monetary instrument. It's interesting. I think I will reserve personal commentary and opinions on it because I think crypto is something that people get very, very wound up about. But yeah, it's been very interesting. And yes, to your point, that has absolutely been the buzz of the convention. Obviously, it's a very single-sided opinion down at the crypto show because you've got literally that market. But it's been very interesting being down there. And I think what's cool for me with crypto is that it's kind of like the cutting edge of payments in a way, because we all know, right, not everything about payments is cutting edge. In fact, a lot of parts of chargebacks are the antithesis of cutting edge.
Right.
But right, like crypto is kind of on the opposite end of it. And so it's kind of interesting because you can use the problems and the stuff that they're facing as a litmus or kind of like a forecast for what's coming for everybody else. And so I enjoy going down there. It's been a very interesting show. But the other thing that I'll say is I'm familiar with that show. It's been in Vegas for a number of years. Holy crap, did that show expand and explode between last year and this year. If I had to guess, the show is about 2 times the footprint just between last year and this year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Just from last year. And if that tells you just anything about the popularity of that as a payment method, yeah, that'll be huge. I'd be interested to see from like the consumer protection side, what sort of mechanism that they're going to instill if they haven't done that already. I know that's something that I'm keeping an eye out for. I know something when people were talking about it replacing cards and everything like that. I know we're still getting that rolled out, but that was one of the big
dude,
yeah.
you're edging around open banking right now, right? I mean, ultimately that's what Bitcoin is struggling with is right, it's a monetary instrument that's stored digitally, but they don't have a way of moving it around, right? There are no rails, there's no Visa MasterCard network that's ubiquitous, right? Like blockchain interoperability is the buzzword that you're looking for. Crypto and blockchain is something that I enjoy. But the idea is right, like not all crypto wallets are able to talk to each other, just like how, right, like this terminal previously was only set up to talk to Amex, and now we've got a bit more of a consolidated network environment from a card processing perspective. But what you've seen and what I saw at this show is you're seeing cryptocurrency being processed on credit card rails, man. That means that consumer protection question is answered, right?
Yeah.
Because what they've done is that you now have an organization that is converting the Bitcoin into US dollars and allowing you to spend in, right, like a native currency that then gets transacted. They're handling all of that. And so they've kind of retrofitted Bitcoin onto credit card rails, which means that chargebacks are the way that would be handled. For everything else, what you've seen and what was cool about this show, I'll shut up in a second, is right, you've got like a barber shop set up and you can pay with Bitcoin. You've got a store where these people, and like it's all pay with Bitcoin. And so, right, like it's almost like if you're the person with cash or a credit card at this show, you can't actually buy things. It's a little weird. Because right, it's set up around that. Like these are literally the people that want to kind of drive that. But ultimately, that's what you see happening right now is there's 6 or 7 Bitcoin Pay, let's call it, right? Kind of like what you saw with Google Pay, Apple Pay, right? Everybody's got to have their own brand. So you've got that like VHS versus Betamax race going on right now for what's going to be the one to rule them all for paying with your cryptocurrency. And so those are the 2 real ways, right? You're the 3 real ways. You've got open banking, which is like the ubiquitous, it's all open. The banks talk to each other. You've got using credit card rails, and then you've got these systems that are being developed that are kind of like a mini Visa, where it's rails specifically for Bitcoin. And it only works if you've got their app and the merchant's got their app, right? So obviously I don't need to get into the problems associated with that adoption.
All right, well that's settled. We're getting it on the books to have a podcast and all these updates on crypto. And it's something that's been up in the air, but there seems to be a lot of decisions that have been made to where this is something that's going to be rolled out, maybe possibly accepted by more merchants. So yeah, we're definitely going to get that on the books, and yeah, I definitely want to get your thoughts on that too whenever we do that. So I'll keep you posted, man.
Or endorsement. This is because of the administration that we have. Period. Without a doubt, like the climate changing like it has is the Biden administration to the Trump administration. There could not be any more different take on how to manage and roll out cryptocurrency. And so I agree. I think you're going to continue to see an acceleration in regulation, not necessarily to slow it down, but regulation to maybe speed it up. Because as an example, chargebacks, that was a regulation that was intended to speed up the adoption of credit card payments, right? And so I think you're going to start to see similar compliance related items, to your point about consumer protection, to make it safer, friendlier, easier, more accessible to operate around Bitcoin. And it'll be interesting to see which way that goes. Like I said, those are the 3 different primary venues or avenues that I see. And one of them is really just Bitcoin via the existing status quo, right? MasterCard.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with the president rolling out his own Bitcoin, we may see some of those conversations expedited a little bit, I'd say.
Yep.
But all right, well, Bitcoin, that'll be for another day. Today, we are getting into VAMP. We're going to be walking through what exactly has changed, what changes are to come. We're going to be looking at some key dates. We're going to be looking at some thresholds, how it's going to be impacting merchants, not only with their payment processor, but with their acquiring banks. So a lot of changes, a lot of shakeups in the way that Visa is looking to tackle fraud right now. So we're going to be taking a look at that, and we're going to dive right in. So with that, Zach, let's get to it. So taking a look at what is VAMP. So first things first, VAMP, it sounds intense, right? It sounds like a risk compliance vampire, but what is it actually? So VAMP it stands for Visa Acquire Monitoring Program. It's basically Visa's new way of keeping tabs on fraud and chargeback activity across the entire payments ecosystem. So it replaces the old monitoring programs, VDMP and VFMP, and combines them into one unified system. So the goal is to make things a little bit simpler and more consistent, but also a bit stricter. Instead of tracking fraud and disputes separately, VAMP is going to roll them into a single metric called the VAMP ratio, which gives Visa and your acquirers a clear picture of how risky a merchant might be when it comes to fraud. Zach, if you can give us a little bit more detail about this new VAMP system and what it means for merchants.
Yeah, so we say that it's an update, and I promise I won't make this joke too much, right? But it's really a cascade of updates that have come to the program. And as Justin said, right, it's replacing what was previously VDMP and VFMP. But if I had one tagline to associate with rolling out a VAMP, I think every announcement or communication that's come from Visa through the cascade of changes that there's been has been a consistent message that these changes are aimed at putting a greater emphasis on preventing fraud. And I think that is going to be the underlying, right? Like it still measures fraud and not fraud, but I think as we talk, it's going to become very clear that there's a behavior change that Visa is looking for here. And I think part of what we're going to talk about in terms of like what you can do to prepare for these changes is ultimately what are those behavior changes that Visa is looking for. And I think, like I said, they gave that away up front with how much they've talked about fraud, and fraud ultimately needing to be prevented up front, not just given a refund, is actually a paraphrased quote of sorts from one of the releases that they gave. And so as we step into this, that'll really be my perspective. And so again, I'd summarize it as they're doubling down on fraud really needing to be stopped at the door.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good summary. So getting right into the real shakeup of what VAMP brings, Visa's last minute rule change, they announced back even just a couple weeks ago. So when we say last minute, it is last minute. This is definitely a landscape, like I said, that is evolving. So from what I understand, if a fraud dispute gets resolved through something like RDR or CDRN, tools that were supposed to help reduce your fraud ratios, it now still counts against you under VAMP. Now that sounds like a big deal. Zach, why did Visa decide to make that change so close to the launch?
Yeah, I mean, and ironically, there was another change that they made even more recently around what those thresholds are. So for those of you that aren't aware, May, I think it was 15th or 16th, there was another round of changes that were released by Visa, actually. So right, we said it was live April 1st. They've changed it while in flight. And I think that's going back to some of what we've talked about here. So the summary is, as Justin said, an RDR, if you just are giving refunds via RDR and as a merchant, that's your chargeback strategy, Visa's basically coming out and saying that that's not enough. If you're letting fraud through, giving the customer their money back afterwards isn't an acceptable remedy anymore. And that's right, like that's where that's coming from. If a TC40 is filed, it doesn't matter what you did. If you've refunded it, it still counts. Now, one thing that I am going to call out here that's a little bit of an asterisk, and there's a lot of chat back and forth in the market because it comes down to a handful of things. And the statement that CDRN, if a CDRN triggers a TC40, that'll still count in your VAMP ratio. But if CDRN works the way that it's supposed to, and you provide a timely refund that is correctly conveyed back to the network and the issuer doesn't have to file a chargeback at all, which means that a TC40 is not raised. And so a CDRN alert can still stop or prevent it from showing up in your ratio if it's done in a way and works without having a TC40 raised. However, sometimes they still are. That's true as well of Ethica as a crossover product for alerting as well. But the big thing is if your strategy for avoiding being on the naughty list, right, whether it's called VAMP or VDMP or right, like change the acronym, but if your chargeback strategy is just RDR and giving refunds, that's not going to work anymore. Because if we examine the math, technically a fraud chargeback is counting in both of your ratios because it's TC40s plus chargebacks, which is TC40s and TC15s again. So if you have a TC40 that's raised, there's a chargeback that comes with that. So that counts twice in the numerator. And that's what I mean when I say fraud is the new focus. And so giving a refund, if it hits an RDR, it's already in, there's a chargeback being raised. It's too late at that point. That doesn't remove the TC40. It just avoids the chargeback, which means, right, like you're not double penalized for it, but it's still in your ratio. The big summary here, guys, is that Visa wants merchants to take a more comprehensive strategy for preventing fraud. And you'll see that when we talk about the enumeration ratio as well, which has, it looks at a very different part of the equation, not chargebacks directly.
Mm-hmm. Now, so for merchants who are relying on RDR for alerts and to keep their fraud numbers down, what does this mean for them? Are they suddenly going to get flagged more?
I mean, if you just do some math, and we can do this more when we talk about the ratios, there's a lot of people that if your strategy that's keeping you under the ratio today, it really depends on where your chargebacks are coming from. So if you have a chargeback problem that is mostly fraud, these changes, RDR, and RDR is how you're fixing it, you're probably going to have to look at it because you'll be in breach with the new ratios. Because what's going to happen is that the TC40 still stays in the numerator. It didn't used to. It used to go away. If you have a non-fraud problem, an RDR still will remove a TC15. And so, right, because the TC15 is only being counted if it results in a chargeback. If you give them a refund, it doesn't raise a chargeback. So the point here is that it depends. If a merchant is close to breaching because of a non-fraud driven chargeback problem, then these changes may actually benefit them because the ratios, as we'll explore, they've raised the ratios actually because they mathematically have to. They're putting more stuff in the numerator. And so at the end of the day, it really depends on what your chargeback mixture looks like. But if your only strategy is RDR and giving refunds, your ratios are probably going to move in a negative, as in up perspective, just based on it's not the behavior that they want. They want customers and merchants to be taking and leveraging a multi-tiered approach. And right, like ultimately, that's what these changes point to, is that you're going to have to leverage things like compelling evidence 3.0 as an example to identify when a fraud reason code is being used and it's friendly fraud. Those types of things, and we can, again, we'll cover this more when we get into the ratio changes, but right, those products are going to move the needle a lot more than RDR is going to be able to with these changes.
Yeah, and with that, let's talk numbers. Let's get into the nitty gritty of it. For merchants, this is where it might get a little nerve wracking. So with thresholds and penalties, Zach, can you kind of break down what these new thresholds are for merchants and acquirers? How some of these penalties work if someone does cross that line?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just talk about before the change versus now to kind of drive some of this home on why they had to why they had to raise the ratio. So under the old system, if you had 70 fraud disputes and 10 non-fraud disputes out of 10,000 transactions, right? So if you have 80 total, you would have 80 into 10,000, which is a 0.8% ratio, which is just below the old 0.9 that we were working on before these changes. Under VAMP, the same merchant with the same 70 TC40s and 10 TC15s would now have 70 TC40s plus 80 disputes in the numerator if all they're doing is resolving with RDR divided by 10,000, meaning that they're at 1.5, which is already the 2026 threshold. And so they've raised the thresholds, but they've raised the thresholds in a way that ultimately will be more favorable for you if you have less fraud reason code chargebacks, because the fraud reason code chargebacks are essentially being double penalized with the way that the new ratio, there's a weighting being associated to them, you could say. And so what we're seeing is that when we roll out the thresholds effective October 1st, now they're measuring these and they're going to tell you where you land based on these calculations starting immediately, but they're not going to start actually penalizing people until October 1st this year. And that merchant ratio is 2.2. Acquirers won't have one initially, but you'll notice that in April 1st of 2026, a year after the program went live, merchants will be down to a 1.5% ratio, which is why I'm using that in my example, manage towards the future, because then when it gets here, you won't have a problem. And then, but the other piece of this is there's an acquirer ratio now, which is something that was never looked at before. And I think if you're thinking as a merchant, well, I'm a merchant, not an acquirer, that's not going to impact me, you're thinking about it wrong. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides.
Yeah, so Visa is obviously going to set their own thresholds, but now that acquirers are going to have to adhere to a Visa threshold. I mean, you may have a situation where acquirers, may even have stricter protocols for that. Can you kind of explain how that works? Like, what if a merchant is technically under Visa's threshold, but their acquirer still penalizes them? How's that going to work out?
So that would be stuff that would probably live inside of the commercial agreements that you're going to have with your acquirers, and that's pretty standard, right? They pass through or don't pass through certain fees from the networks, and ultimately the way that they're charging for the processing that you guys get from them is it's all based on a risk table and right all the different pieces that go into it. Ultimately, what this means is that now they have to manage against a new risk metric that's going to be pushed down to the merchants in a different way, right? So yesterday they only had to keep each individual merchant below 0.9, which meant that theoretically an acquirer could have an average of 0.9 across their entire portfolio, or excuse me, let's say 0.8 because it's under 0.9, right? 0.8 across their whole portfolio and still be compliant. Mathematically, that doesn't work anymore because the acquirer ratio is half of the individual merchant ratio, which just mathematically tells me they're establishing an idea that if a merchant has a ratio that's at X level, cool, that's one level of regulation, but they're now holding acquirers liable or responsible for managing the risk at their level as well, and saying that, right, your portfolio as an average has to have slightly less than half of the merchant ratio. So if I were a betting man, what I would guess this is going to start to see, right? They're creating an implicit incentive for merchants, right? For acquirers to have some merchants that are well below, because, right, if I'm going to have you at 1.5 on the new ratio, you're going to blow my acquirer merchant. So for everybody that's at 1.5, right, I've got to have someone that's around 0.2 to balance that off, right? And that's the whole thing is it equal parts on both sides of the scheme, or excuse me, of the distribution of the math. And so I think if we think about it, what you might see this manifest as, I could see this going a lot of different ways, but I think you're going to see acquirers starting to manage their book of business different than they have traditionally. Because if we look at the payment space, we have payments providers that you could classify as more traditionally, or rather less averse to high risk business, right? Maybe they're a more high risk acquirer. I think those types of portfolios of business are going to start to have issues because that acquiring ratio, if you have a portfolio of people that are over 0.7 as an acquirer now, you're in trouble. And so they have to either fire customers or create incentives for people to ride lower in their ratio than what Visa allows them. In terms of what that's going to look like, the future is going to literally be a situation where you're going to have to track what your ratio requirement is at your acquirer, which may be different acquirer to acquirer, and make sure that you're below it. Otherwise, you're going to get fees from your acquirer. And if you're over Visas, then you'd be in violation of both. You'd get double fees. And so this is again, it's a prediction of where we're going because it hasn't started yet. But these fee changes and the associated program changes are already starting to create ripple effect in the acquirers of the merchants that we work with. And so what I would say is again, if you think that the acquirer ratio is not going to impact you as a merchant, you're thinking about it wrong.
Yeah, and if you're a merchant out there who's handling everything in-house, just like we saw a couple weeks ago with the updated thresholds, it might be a good idea to maybe set up a Google alert or check in every few days with Visa to see if they come up with a new announcement, because even those thresholds that Visa set, they may be subject to change like we just saw a couple weeks ago. So be sure if you are handling those things in-house, be sure to keep up with that. See what's happening to the merchant threshold and see if there's any changes coming to the acquirer threshold as well, because that will impact you. Yep.
One quick point that I completely agree with that. Absolutely stay on top of the changes. But if you analyze the changes at a macro level, they've moved around the center point, which is what I think Visa I think that's where we're managing to. And all they've really done is they've pushed out the timeline, right? They're giving people more time to prepare for this. But if I analyze the changes that have been made, it's more about tempo and rollout than it is about what the endpoint destination is. That hasn't changed a whole lot. What they've waffled around is will RDR resolve, right? They pulled that in and out. But again, I think they gave their hand away up front when they said fraud needs to be prevented and a refund is not an acceptable way of providing a remedy, right? So absolutely keep up on the changes, but I think at the end of the day, if they relax or move something out as a merchant, you should tighten your belt and try to stay ahead of it, because just like with a flight being delayed, they can move it right back up. They reserve that right. And so, right, like I wouldn't continue to let this be something that's pushed off, because ultimately the reason that it's being done in that manner, my opinion, is that Visa is trying to provide time to the industry and the players that are involved to prepare and do what they need to do. And so I would make use of that time while still staying on top of the changes, because as we've noted, they're still kind of taking feedback and iterating through where this is going to finally end up.
No, that's a great point. All right, so next we'll kind of want to get into the enumeration ratio. Say that 10 times fast. So the next part might sound a little bit confusing. There might have been some merchants on the call today who might have had to do a quick Google when we first announced that term. But Zach, can you kind of walk us through what this is, how Visa's tracking it, and how Visa's enumeration ratio is going to come into play for merchant?
Yeah, so this is really a risk assessment ratio is a really great way to think about it. So what it's aimed at measuring is essentially helping merchants or holding merchants accountable for tracking and combating card testing fraud, or what's known as enumeration fraud on their platform. So the reason it's called enumeration fraud, usually you get a set of card data and the personal details, but you don't know which ones go together. And that's the way that this stuff is sold on the black market. And so, right, what a scammer has to do for fraud, true fraud, is they have to enumerate through it. And so they're testing a variety of things like data points, how much, right, like what's the credit limit, because these are things they don't know. And so this is essentially, the way that this is measured is it's your declines divided by your total transactions. And it's looking at, right, like what's the health of the transactions that are going through your platform. And basically what they're looking at is do you have an above average decline rate, which implies that you're allowing people to continually hit you with new attempts versus stopping them from doing so. And the reason that Visa cares about this is that it's a precursory indicator of fraud. And so again, back to my statement, I'm going to keep banging that drum. I really, really think that Visa's doubling down on holding merchants and acquirers accountable for doing everything they can to stop fraud on their platform. And doing everything they can means making use of all of the levers, tools, and services that are available to you as a merchant, which is why this enumeration ratio is looking at something that they haven't looked at before inside of this program.
Now, is there a way to know if enumeration fraud is happening to a merchant? Are there any signs that a merchant should be aware of and look out for if they're being hit by card testing?
Big things are going to be like changes in, so if you're looking at the actual granular data, yeah, absolutely. You can see the details being passed. Obviously, not every merchant's going to be able to look at it that way. From a trending perspective, if you have big changes in your decline rate without a correlated change in a process, whether that's a marketing, sale, payments process, something like that, that's indicative of it, particularly if your decline rate goes up, right? Like that's indicative of, right, like you're not letting the transactions being stopped, great, but there's a high frequency. And then you can also, with internal, you can look at the decline rate and look at the drivers of that, right? Like are there any data characteristics that are driving that from a decline perspective? Like, do you have an abnormal amount of declines coming from a specific IP address, from a particular geo, etc.? And look for it that way, because unless the scammer's very, very sophisticated, you're going to see some kind of aggregation.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. All right, well, we need a silver lining to all of this. So let's pivot to something a little more hopeful, and that's what merchants can actually do about all this. So if I'm a merchant right now, what are those top tools or steps that I should be looking into to stay compliant under this VAMP rollout?
Yeah, so I think the first one is, Visa hasn't said it overtly, but right, like stopping fraud at the door is what I would call the tagline for their updates. And so, right, if that's the case, then there's true fraud, which is what do you do about true fraud? And they think that that's stop it at the door. So that's fraud filters, that's doing better to analyze those, identify real fraud, and stop it at the door. The enumeration ratio and actually paying attention to and understanding that is a really great starting point for that. Because if you have a declines problem, it's almost always indicative of someone at least using your platform for naughty things that lead to fraud. And so, right, like that's a great starting point. But then I think what I've heard from a lot of customers that we work with is, particularly for subscription, right? There's merchants that feel like they have a problem with fraud reason codes that are being used incorrectly. That is, someone will cancel their membership by calling their bank and claiming fraud. And I think there's a very specific fix for that, and it's compelling evidence 3.0. Right, like ultimately that's the only existing way, right? I think we as an industry are going to have to get smarter and iterate, and I think you're going to even see new things from Visa potentially, right? But I think what's available to us today is compelling evidence 3.0, and I think that's the biggest thing, right? If you can show that the customer has a relationship with you or any kind of business history, then that allows you to avoid having to take a chargeback being raised against you. And so that's a way of, right, and that's also, by the way, before RDR and other stuff, so you can still refund it and do stuff like that to avoid the double paying for it. So it's putting another layer in your strategy where CE 3.0 really is intended to help merchants separate between, right, claims of fraud and actual fraud. And I think the other thing that I'll say to that is historically we've talked to merchants that haven't been able to implement this because the way that they store data isn't correct, etc. I'd go back to it. I think Visa is saying that's no longer an excuse. And so I would take this time that you've got, because it takes a year of history. You have to store that data for a year. Hey, guess what? How long are they giving you guys before this actually takes effect? A year, right? And so they understand that this is something that may require, it feels like Visa understands. Again, I'm not Visa, these are opinions of my own, right? But it feels like Visa understands that these are long-term change management activities that, right, like if you don't have the data, you should be talking to someone today or figuring out today how you're going to start storing the data, because ultimately this is going to be an incredibly important strategy or part of the strategy for many people that were just refunding these previously, right? Again, if your strategy, your chargeback strategy was primarily mitigate by RDR, we gotta have a conversation, because you need to shift that to somewhere else, because the efficacy of RDR is probably the biggest change in these rule changes.
And you kind of hit on it just a second ago with the subscription services, right? You have people filing chargebacks on subscriptions that they either forgot about or ones that they used, weren't satisfied, and went back rather than going through the refund program. We saw from our cardholder dispute index last year, that 90% of cardholders would prefer that their banks can cancel subscriptions on their behalf. If that just tells you the mentality of cardholders and wanting to go to their bank first. So I know the FTC launched their new click to cancel rule change that they had, saying that subscription merchants or merchants with subscription-based services need to make it just as easy to cancel as it was to signing up. And a lot of merchants kind of took that as it being easier to cancel, or at least not as complex to cancel. That was going to mean less people using their services. But we kind of saw that as a little bit of a push from regulators to have these cardholders reach out to the merchants first, which is great. That's what we wanted. They contact their bank first. That's when you're going to see that chargeback and go through you go through that whole process where you're going to lose. You're going to get a ding on your merchant account. You're going to get to assess that chargeback fee that won't be recouped, even if it's overturned in the representment process. So that's something to definitely take note of if you offer subscription services for your in your company. One of the changes that are already live that came through.
I apologize, Justin, if we could go back real quick. I think one other thing that I actually really want to spend a little bit of time on. So just because I think we focused a lot on the high risk side of things, another potential impact that this may have for merchants that are managing their ratio that don't have a breaching problem, and right, so they're not using alerts, right? So this could be more enterprise merchants. Anybody with an indemnification strategy, this may also have some interesting impacts, because right, indemnification is the idea of working with a provider that your fraud filter says, hey, I don't think you should take this, it's fraud. So then you send it to a second party that says, hey, actually, if you accept it, I'll indemnify the cost of the chargeback. The key here is refunding it, RDR, the strategies that some of those companies used in those situations to avoid the hit don't work anymore if it's a fraud chargeback. And indemnification is specifically focused on fraud reason codes and fraud chargebacks, so it's 100% overlap. But any company with a large indemnification strategy should review this, because not only is it regulatory fees, fines through VAMP, but there's also fees associated with the way that, right, like what Visa's passing through for things like that as well, that'll be impacted. So I think at the end of the day, right, like the compliance strategy that's safe is take a look at and make sure that you don't need to overhaul your compliance strategy, because the changes that Visa has made are sweeping. And it's not just high risk merchants. We're focusing there because I think, right, they've said we want to stop fraud at the door. High risk, the reason they're high risk is because there's the higher chargeback ratio, et cetera. It just flows there. But at the end of the day, the changes that they've made are systemic and environmental, and it will impact everyone. Like I said, as an example, indemnification strategy, particularly if you're an enterprise merchant, there will be impacts there, and I recommend you take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So taking a look at, what's the action plan for some of these merchants. So, some of these changes, they're coming through. We showed you some of those key dates that are coming up. The VAMP ratio is going to be tracked, and we're kind of in this grace period for merchants to get their procedures in order, alter the things that need to be altered. So if I'm a merchant, Zach, and I've started getting those advisory notifications from Visa, what's the move? What should I be doing right now if I'm a merchant?
Yeah, so think of it this way. You've got a couple gates. You've got the advisory period, and I'm looking at this. Some of the dates and the things on this slide are not correct with the latest round of changes. So again, +5 points on making sure that you look for the latest and greatest. So what they've been doing is they've extended the grace period. So before it was a 3-month grace period from October 11th. Now, or excuse me, from April 1st. So now that would have been July 1st is when stuff was going to roll in. Now nothing rolls into effect until October. So they've doubled the advisory period, but the way you want to manage that is still the same, right? You know the end goal. At the end, at April of next year, you got to be at 1.5. There's obviously no benefit for being there ahead of time that's articulated other than just not having to worry about it. But that's my advice, because here's the other thing. This is what Visa's doing. You're going to see the acquirers layer in their own requirements, their own rollout, and all of that stuff as well. And if you recall, the acquirer thresholds start to go into play in October, and then there's another ramp up in January, and then another one in April. And so there's a lot of cascading changes here. What I would say, stay ahead of it and manage it more aggressively. So if we know that the 1.5 is going to be the end point and 0.7 for acquirers, you probably shouldn't count on being safe at 1.4, because at some point your acquirer is going to come out and provide either a carrot or a stick for you to be at or below their threshold of 0.7. So what I would recommend is that you should be aiming and tracking to try to either understand what your acquirer is going to be doing for managing that, or until you understand what they're going to be doing with it, aim for 0.7 or lower, because you know that that's very likely to be a point where your acquirer is going to become interested at some point in keeping you at or below. Again, whether it costs you more to be above it or you're rewarded for being below it, I think we're going to see some type of financial lever become associated with this and being managed at the acquirer level.
And aside from, being complacent or procrastinating on this, what's the biggest mistake a merchant can make during this advisory window?
I think it's what I just said. It's not taking into account how that acquirer ratio is going to impact them, right? Like, you can't, as a merchant now, just sit there and say, oh, well, I'm under my individual merchant ratio. If you don't know whether or not you're with an acquirer that's going to need you to buckle down, right? Like, and that's the whole point. Until you understand what the impact and scope of these changes are going to be for the acquirers that you acquire with, because as an example, right, Bank A that has a traditionally low risk profile may have a ratio of 0.4. They don't care. They don't have to do anything. A bank that's got a traditionally high risk portfolio may be sitting at 1.2 because, right, most of their merchants are close to breaching. They're going to be making changes to their portfolio, whether it's changing the way that right, like getting new customers that are lower risk or getting rid of the ones that are high risk, right? But something has to change mathematically. It tells us that. And so I think that would be the biggest mistake that you could make as a merchant, is managing toward your own individual ratio without an understanding of how your acquirer is going to regulate this, because that's not entirely determined yet. In fact, I think we're going to see the next 3 to 6 months provide more information on that level of detail. Yeah,
I'd be interested to see what some of those acquirers, what their own thresholds and those penalties look like for merchants. So yeah, definitely something that you as a merchant want to stay on top of. All right, perfect. Well, I know that was probably a lot to unpack. For merchants tuning into all that, if that's your first time hearing about VAMP, it sounds like a lot, but as I said, you got a little bit of a grace period to get everything in order. But Zach, thanks so much for kind of running us through, helping us read between the lines of what some of these changes might mean. So with that, we're going to get to some of the questions that we had submitted. Again, if you guys have some questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll certainly get to those after the webinar. We'll reach out via email, but for now, we'll get to some of the questions that we received. The first one is from Tiago. It said, will this program lead into bigger changes in the payment industry, especially on acquirers?
So I will not beat a dead horse on this question, because I feel like I've spent a lot of time on this. I personally think that is exactly where we're going to see a lot of the most variant changes, is maybe the way to think about it. I think, right, Visa's made their changes. They may go back and forth, but that's one layer. I think the changes that they're pushing to the acquirers is going to drive a lot more complexity, just because that ecosystem is much more complex. It's not just Visa, it's thousands of acquirers. And so I think, to Tiago's question, I think that's actually where the majority of the long-term stuff is. I think we're starting here because the merchants are all where it starts and it's going to go up. But I think ultimately the bigger changes in terms of like differences between this program and the other one are probably going to be at the acquirer level, specifically that I think merchants are going to have to manage to an acquirer ratio, because we know that acquirers are being managed now via Visa for a ratio.
And kind of a side question, Zach, do you, in your opinion, do you think that this is that this move by Visa is going to be that we're going to be seeing that from other major card networks as well?
They tend to follow each other.
Yeah.
So I do think, right, like maybe not all the time, but if I just look at the cycle of innovation, what usually happens is if you look at the market controllers, one of them steps forward, the other one sits there and watches and waits and sees how it goes, and then either does their own thing because it didn't go the way that they thought it should, or follows suit. So I think right, anytime Visa or MasterCard endeavors to do something, I think the other one's always watching and waiting. And then obviously you've got Amex and Discover that tend to not be that different from the rest. But I think this is absolutely going to cascade. I think the other point that I would make on acquirer behavior, you might see acquirers get a bit more aggressively invested in risk management strategies, up to and including things like auto enrollment in certain deflection tools, stuff like that, right? Like I think it's not really clear what that's going to look like, but it's what's clear to me is that the acquirers are going to be exercising more influence because Visa's essentially said that they need to.
Gotcha. All right, our next question comes from Marco. He asks, with RDR, I'm able to lower my chargeback ratio to 1 to 1.5%. If VAMP comes into effect, I'll be pushed out of the market because my chargeback ratio will rise around 2.5 to 3% based on Visa's approach. What can I do?
Yeah, so I think historically, there was some confusion when Visa rolled out RDR for why would I use CDRN? And I think these changes will actually illuminate some of that. So if you're just using RDR, that's not the same as CDRN and RDR, Ethica CDR and RDR, because those go in an order. By the time it gets to an RDR, that's why. So basically, like let's just unpack the topic of why they're not backing this stuff out. What they're basically saying is if a TC40 gets filed, we're not going to check and run it against CDRNs and remove it if there was a CDRN. If a TC40 gets filed, we're not going to reach out to Ethica, right? So it's about if the TC40 gets filed. So what you can do is implement Ethica and CDRN with a provider that's integrated to send those responses through immediately, not batching them and sending them at the end of the day, et cetera. Invest and look at your technology, right? Because realistically, if you are able to enroll in CDRN and respond to it immediately before it gets pushed to an RDR, then maybe a chargeback never gets filed, maybe a TC40 never gets raised. And so that actually may have more impact on your ratio than RDR. And those changes are now doubled down on because of the way that the math has been changed. And so what I would say is I would look at Ethica and CDRN, but also, and this is the without a doubt statement, compelling evidence 3.0, especially if you have any kind of subscription product, which I'm going to guess just based on the ratio, it's either a subscription or some kind of high risk market. So I would look at CE 3.0, but also just to be cavalier, right? Set up a call with us. We're more than happy to take a look at it with you, right? These aren't things that you have to do alone. I think that's ultimately, and again, sorry for the shameless sales plug, I think that's what I love about, right, our organization. We really look at it from a comprehensive defense strategy perspective. And my title is solutions engineering. My job is to help build those solutions, right? So we have a team of people. I do a lot of the solutioning myself, but reach out to us, set up a solution, and set up a session, and we can take a look at your individual problem, because at the end of the day, each chargeback problem is unique based on a variety of factors. And so even something like what percentage of those chargebacks is fraud versus not fraud may change my answer. But the answer, to be brief, is there's a lot of things that you can do if you're only using RDR, because again, I believe that that's the behavior that Visa is looking to change. They want you to take a multi-tiered, multifaceted strategy.
All right. Our next question comes from Michiel, and sorry if I butchered that name. We've got folks from all over the world joining us today. So Michiel asks, what measures can we take to avoid chargebacks after processing a customer refund?
So I'm going to approach this from a bunch of different angles because I can read this question a bunch of different ways. So if I reach out to you guys and I, right, like your organization, and I request a refund, right, make sure that you are sending a confirmation of the refund with a refund number to the customer, right? Communication is a really big piece with that. So like, don't be like, hey, do you want your number for this, and not give it to the customer? Like, your process should be like, get an email and send them a receipt of it, those types of things. Because sometimes what happens is the customer just doesn't think that it happened quick enough, right? Those types of things. But clearly establish the timeline and make sure that they're processed promptly, right? Because what we find a lot of times is we look at it where, well, it's a batch process. So you request a refund, a supervisor has to look at it, and by the time it gets sent in for a refund, it's 2 business days later. So the customer's being told 3 to 5 business days, they're not getting it until 7 business days. They called their bank at 3. Those types of things. It's very common. And so, right, like the idea here is, and I think we mentioned it with the click to cancel, if the customer is entitled to their money back and they're going to be right, and it's a situation where they can file a chargeback, like the regulation from Visa, from the government, is headed in the direction where merchants are being encouraged to give the money back. And so, right, like if you're going to give a refund, do it promptly and be communicative as heck about it are the 2 keys there. If it's in response to an alert, right, an alert is raised, meaning you know you have a chargeback coming and you're trying to stop the chargeback. I mean, obviously, we know, and we've covered this thoroughly, RDR isn't going to be the way that we do that anymore. So if we're using Ethica, CDRN, et cetera, you can absolutely make sure that you are, again, responding to those alerts as quickly as possible. Work with a provider like CB911, where we have really, really aggressive SLAs to take care of them, right? We're closing those alerts within 15 minutes, not, right? Again, so Ethica gives you 24 hours, CDRN gives you 72, but that's just the guarantee for them. But again, if you still get a chargeback, they'll give you your money back, but it's in your ratio. So again, if your concern is protecting your ratio, respond to those alerts as quickly as possible. Make sure that you're working with a provider that's sending your response back directly. So, right, an authorized reseller, the closer you are to working with them, the quicker it's going to go back. So, right, again, we are a direct reseller of Verify and Ethica. So that's an example of that. But these types of technology pieces become really important, because what you're trying to get to is letting the issuing bank know that that refund was processed, so that if the customer does call back, or a chargeback doesn't get filed, they get told, well, hey, I can see a refund is on the way. So, and again, if that was in a conversation with just you and the customer, make sure that they've got the evidence. The last point that I'll make is, you've heard me talk a lot about compelling evidence that's tied with a service called Order Insights. One of the things that think of it as a data exchange. That type of information can also be used to convey that to the issuing bank at the time of the chargeback. So if you've integrated correctly, again, with a provider that has access to this stuff, you can make sure that you're sending the information that a refund was provided with the time that it was provided, the confirmation of the refund, etc. So then the issuing bank is more likely to say, well, hey, I can see that a refund was processed yesterday. It's probably still coming through, etc.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with as far as being communicative and reachable for from a customer service standpoint. I won't veer too far off the path of the webinar today, but we do have a lot of resources and blog articles about best customer service approaches to help drive them to the merchant as opposed to their issuing bank. We're in a world where merchants are competing with issuing banks for a cardholder's convenience, and so it's very much an uphill battle. So if you're wondering how you can sort of optimize those internal processes, we've got some great resources on our website, different ways on how to do that. All right, our next question comes from Rob. He asks, how are the enumeration attacks measured so I can check my current status? Zach, I know you hit on the equation earlier, but would you mind tackling this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just so it's your declines plus approved it's your declines divided by your total accepted transactions. So it's looking at what percentage of your processing volumes are resulting in a decline. And the way that you'd get that information, right? Like depending on how your processing is laid out, you can get it your processor, different levels will give you those measurements, but that's something that should be a metric that's really easy for you to get. And so, it's just a matter of taking those as a number of transactions and doing some math that blends that back so that you're not just looking at your decline rate, but you're essentially looking at your decline rate as a ratio or like a mix into your total transactions.
All right, that was a great conversation, Zach. Thank you so much. I think we learned a lot about what this new program entails. I think that after sort of hearing your interpretations of it, what we're going to be seeing, what all this indicates, I think merchants, especially those who attended today's webinar, have a very much a better insight as to what is to come and how they can better prepare for it. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge as always.
Of course, thanks for having me.
All right, so thank you for tuning in for another episode of ChargeForward Chargebacks 911. As always, you can find more information on regulatory updates, card network rule changes, and all things chargebacks at chargebacks911.com. Be sure to check out our other episodes for topics we covered around retail payments and everything else involving transactions. Take care, and we'll see you next time.